So my name is Anastasia Tarmann, and my day job is to work at the Alaska State Library Historical Collections. And in this capacity, I have come across some documents, and I also have had a lot of conversations with my colleague, who happens to be from the Aakw'an as well. I want to myself thank the Douglas Indian Associations and members of the Aakw'an for sharing time, experience, and thoughts with me. And I do want to thank my colleague, Sorrel Goodwin, for sharing his research and many of his ideas. I've discussed these topics with all of these people I've mentioned. But the words said here are my own, and I take full responsibility for them. I want to share something with you that I have noticed. You've probably noticed this too. Juneau Douglas has signs and monuments and statues everywhere, interpreting history from Western ideologies, giving the impression that local history began with the Alaska Purchase and with the gold rush. A recent letter to the editor regarding proposed Seward statue, the title of the article was, "Will a statue of William Seward be a reminder of Jim Crow in Alaska?" States that the irony in our community is that they took down the Mississippi flag because of what it represented. Yet not a word is being said about the William Seward statue, which as well symbolically could be viewed by our Alaska Native people as a reminder of Jim Crow and the pain and suffering it caused them, and is by no means over or forgotten. Let me remind you that history is curated, meaning that it's interpreted. These are stories that we tell ourselves, and you well know about that. You know about history as a story, but it's your history. What I'm trying to say, though, is that these stories that we tell ourselves, these interpretations, they reinforce or they cultivate relationships. They can make relationships, or they can just reinforce old messages. These relationships are to each other, they are our identities, and they also are possibilities. These interpretive signs, they're tributes in the form of statues, murals, and structures. They dominate the landscape. The message is history begins when Westerners arrive. The message is that morality and virtue begins with Western civilization. And amazingly, this message persists into this century. But there's another narrative, and I'm acknowledging that there is another narrative, and I want to bring forth this narrative and make it more visible. I don't really have a right to do that, and I hope that you will bear with me. But I think that as a person who lives in this community, I want to acknowledge that this narrative exists as well. the way I would like to bring this to your attention is to talk about these very new signs, that these interpretive signs that are going up in Juneau. This one commemorates the Brotherhood Bridge. And I am not criticizing the Brotherhood Bridge. I just want to point out some of the language. So the language it's in the past tense. And I think maybe the one word I want to point out here is that there is a talk about shifting, change, and, you know, the area changed from this name from, they're talking about the glacier, and they're talking about overcoming obstacles. You know, they're talking about the bridge, which leads to the gold, which is overcoming obstacles. They're talking about the glacier is kind of in the way, you know, and so, but then there's change too. So the glacier, you know, it's kind of, it's changing, it's receding, it's doing whatever nature does. And everybody else is changing too, right? So, you know, the gold rush brings lots of change. It brings industry. It brings, you know, work. People go to the mines. And it changes, you know, with the name change, Mendenhall Glacier, it's now called Mendenhall Glacier. First, they say that John Muir named the glacier after the Auk people. I'm sure it had a name before that. And I'm sure that it continues to have that name. But in here, notice the past tense. It says that although changes in the Aakw'an lifestyle occurred, they continued to live in their traditional homeland. That bothers me. I'm sure it bothers you. So, and this hard-earned wisdom, you know, these are these values, these Western values that I'm seeing. And I'm asking, well, you know, who was consulted? And maybe I'm out of line asking that question. Would this be a really different sign, maybe? So, now here's another sign. This is out at the Auk Village recreation area. And the one thing I really want to point out is by 1900, most of the natives had moved to Juneau to work in the mines. And by 1926, all structural remains of the village were gone. Again, you know, it's like Auk history is a preface to Western history. Please forgive me if this is a painful thing I'm pointing out, and that if, you know, if I should cease, you know, please tell me. Here's a picture of Auk Bay and the Auk village, the winter village that they talk about. You know, it's fine. They talk about the winter village, and they talk about how people gardened in the village, and then they just say the people moved. So that gives the impression, to my mind, that people vanished in a way. They left. They abandoned their place, and they abandoned their subsistence practices. But that's not the case. there's clear evidence that Westerners did not encounter a blank slate. And you all know that. You don't need me to bring this up. But there are testimonies in the historical record even from Goldschmidt Haas from the 1940s and from William Paul. Stories that people told about how the Forest Service drove them off of their land. And individuals wanted to charge people for buckets of berries. And people not able to get jobs with the Forest Service once they were unable to access their customary streams for fishing. I know that people here are still fighting for their rights to fish. I heard it again recently. I know that people are still fighting for their lands. And people are grieving their properties, their smokehouses, their gardens, their villages. This is Berners Bay. Brian Wallace took this photo. This is Berners Bay after mining took place. This is said to be Berners Bay Jim, right? Who may have been one of the last shamans. There is testimony that he fought for his lands. And if anybody wants to corroborate that, that would be great to have a real source.
Anastasia, just
Yes.
for other information, my grandfather, which was my dad's father,
Mm-hmm.
my grandfather's sister was married to him.
Oh.
That's why I call Wishkiton my in-laws.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, kind of a picture of the Westward Ho guys, the loggers. And I think, to me, it seems right to say that I can't imagine the grief of not just being forced off of lands, but also seeing the destruction of those lands. And I know that logging and mining have provided an income for people. Clearly, from reading in these testimonies, it wasn't a first choice of people. It may be now, but it wasn't then. And I guess the point I'm making is that when the signs, these interpretations speak in the past tense, and when they talk about people having left their lands, it really seems inaccurate. And I know, I've been told that Taku and Ak people are alive and well and continuing. And I wanted to acknowledge that there are going to be some new poles put up by the Douglas Indian Association through a new grant.
The grant was awarded to Gold Belt Heritage
Okay,
Foundation.
sorry about that.
But it is in partnership with the Douglas Indian Association. And it's important to understand too that the Douglas Indian Association is a federally recognized tribe. They're not in direct competition with clans. They are made up of those clans. The base row membership is comprised of both the Aakw'an and the Tarmann. So and sometimes I think that just gets a little bit skewed, that DIA is in direct competition with a certain clan, and nothing can be further from the truth. And so it was the Douglas Indian Association and representation of honoring that base row membership that worked with the Gold Belt Heritage Foundation. And a lot of that had to do, it stemmed from the unearthing of the graves at Gastineau School. And that just built the momentum to make sure that the history of that area, of this entire region, was made a resurgence. Because sometimes, and this is no respect to the other tribes, the outlying tribes, but as the capital city grew up here, there was less of a tendency to believe that tribes still existed, and clans, but they do. And like you said, they're alive and well. So we're grateful as a tribe to the Gold Belt Heritage Foundation. They won a $1.15 million grant in conjunction also with the library, and who will be working with us on kind of a virtual reality presentation in the museum. We have the grant writer here, one of the grant writers.
Yeah.
And so two totem poles will go up, one at the site of the burned Indian village and another one at the school.
Thank you, Andrea.
Ceremony of totem pole raising?
Pardon?
When's the ceremony of totem pole raising?
The ceremony for the,
Yeah.
it will be, well,
2017 spring for the totem pole raising, and then the big celebration 2018 in conjunction with celebration in Juneau.
And there will be an exhibit at the City Museum in 2017, and Jane Lindsay is here too. Thank you, Jane, for coming. Yeah. So I think I have to wrap up soon. Is that correct? Okay. Well, I have lots of interesting testimony here that shows a whole record of what actually transpired between the Forest Service and the people who were living at the Aakw'an village at the time. There is so much information that you all have as well. And I just merely wanted to raise some of these points and just really talk about how there really isn't a line, you know, that we are not frozen in time, and that we have a say in history and in interpretation of history. And I want to tell you that I so much appreciate the concepts of respect and reciprocity and relationships that I am still learning after being here for 10 years, but they have had a profound effect on my life, and you all have had a profound effect on my life, even though I haven't met many of you, and I hope to meet more of you, and I very much appreciate your all coming and listening to me. And if anybody would like to say anything, I'm going to leave the podium, and it's up to you. I also have lots of pictures. There's a picture of Douglas with fish all over, and probably some of you remember this. Yes. Marie Olson.